and when you feel it, you can feel the silt and you can feel that particles that are in this landscape that help build this land.
LSU's Dr. Robert Twilley shows us the building material for one of the newest spots on Earth.
And this builds that structure, that foundation. I mean, I can barely push this ore, more than about 6 inches down into the soil before it starts to grab the ore and you can't penetrate it.
One of the very few success stories along Louisiana's coast got built by accident. In 1941, the Army Corps of Engineers, to prevent flooding in Morgan City, dug the Wax Lake Outlet, a new channel from the Atchafalaya River to the Gulf. A new delta started forming below the surface, secretly. Little bits of sand and dirt piled up until the river flooded in the early 70s. Suddenly, land popped into view. I'm standing here in just over 1.5 feet of water, about 3/4 of a mile from the new Gulf Coast. When the Great Flood of 1973 happened, before most people were born, this would have been 5 feet of water. Today, freshwater pondweeds grow where the land sticks its toe into the Gulf of Mexico. A couple miles to the north, 30-foot willow trees tower above us on islands that appeared in the 1980s.
This is a very different type of vegetation. This is on the older part of the island.
For decades, Wax Lake has been building elevation and, Twilley says, hurricane protection.
This willow is sort of like the weed tree of the coastal Louisiana, and wherever you find high ground and no salt, this is the tree that you'll find.
Those who oppose diversions ridiculously assert that the river water is poison. If you let it out, it's going to kill all the marsh vegetation. This proves them wrong.
Nothing about the state's ambitious plans for restoring the coast creates more controversy than the idea of letting the river loose, cutting holes in levees, diverting fresh water into the marsh and into the fisheries.
This area, Delacroix area, lost 42 square miles of marshland, and 37 of those 42 square miles was nearest a diversion.
Charter boat captain George Ricks paints a very different picture of diversions. Breton Sound before Katrina and after. Fishermen and some scientists blame the extreme land loss squarely on the Carnarvon diversion.
It's not rooted at all.
They believe river water loaded with fertilizer pollution converted the area to a freshwater marsh, weaker, unable to stand up to storm surge.
It's unfathomable. I mean, you've seen the damage that 8,000 cubic feet a second has done. So if you multiply that by 31 times, what do you think is going to happen?
The state's master plan calls for a massive diversion at Braithwaite, 250,000 cubic feet per second, or approaching the size of the Bonnie Carey Spillway.
They want to turn on a fire hose here, Niagara Falls.
Critics insist this is not the same river man put in a straitjacket. The modern river loaded with poison. A study by the respected Woods Hole Institution cautioned fertilizers in the modern river, nitrates and phosphates, begin destroying freshwater marsh after about 5 years.
What happens is the plants come up and then the leaves are floating right here, and you're actually seeing the flower heads here.
Azure Bevington is a PhD student in coastal wetlands ecology at LSU.
This is not just big muddy, it's big polluted.
Yeah, and I understand. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, in Wisconsin. I'm aware of what comes off of those fields.
Bevington is studying how marsh plants actually filter the nitrates and, together with bacteria, pull pollutants out of the water.
A significant portion of that is being removed from the water as it moves over the wetlands.
Fishermen aren't buying it. 70 years ago, the Wax Lake outlet emptied straight into the Gulf. There was no marsh to harm. They fear a repeat of the Gulf Dead Zone in the estuaries responsible for some of the most productive fisheries on the planet.
It's not okay to put it in the Gulf, but it's okay to put it in the marsh.
Azure Bevington believes the different types of freshwater plants in the new delta, Wax Lake, stand up better to what the river water throws at them.
It's not the same process at all. And so to say freshwater wetlands are more susceptible to hurricane damage does not fit Wax Lake Delta.
Bevington believes river diversions can reverse long-term loss in a coastline that is on a going out of business curve.
So they'll be building instead of dying like the other freshwater marshes.
Robert Twilley argues Carnarvon's a bad comparison.
This is very different than what you find around Carnarvon.
He says the river brings much heavier building material to Wax Lake. Carnarvon was specifically chosen because it holds little sediment.
Well, it was designed as a freshwater diversion, and it's been operated, and the design features are to control salinity. It was never designed to build land.
What do you say to somebody who looks at Wax Lake and says, to George Ricks, how do you not see that it works? Just look at Wax Lake.
Well, you're comparing apples to oranges. For one thing, that's a different part of the state.
An LSU study found the river now packs roughly half the sediment it once did. The rest gets trapped behind hundreds of locks and dams on the various rivers that drain into the Mississippi.
The river in its current state is not natural. It's levied up all the way to almost the Canadian border.
Clint Guidry of the Louisiana Shrimp Association argues we should pick our spots for land building, dredging the river bottom.
If you had the money, why not just dredge and rebuild land that way
That
and not
won't-
put this river?
Right, and so it's all about scaling the problem with the solutions.
Twilley notes the Coastal Master Plan also relies on dredging, delivering land through a pipe. But he argues the cost makes it impossible to dredge enough land, sometimes tens of millions of dollars for a few hundred acres.
It's not open-minded enough. If you were a private corporation and you had to look at this, I think business would look at this a whole lot differently.
Guidry argues the state should find ways to bring down the cost of dredging, continuously operating dredges instead of constantly mobilizing and demobilizing equipment for one small project after another. And then there's the bitter divide over something in short supply: time. The river took 6,000 years to build the delta.
Address the point that is made so often that this just takes so long. We can't afford it.
Yeah, this landscape represents, again, something that grew above water about 30 years ago. The young generation that we have today can see land building and can see some of the vegetation growth like we're looking at today in their lifetime.
Wax Lake began as 5 or 6 feet of water. Twilley says the new diversions will often flow into more shallow water where there was land not that long ago.
But I still argue it's a generation, not thousands of years.
The stakes could not be higher, and many of those most affected, those who rely on this unique landscape for their livelihoods, are the most skeptical.
There is no like project to compare this with. It is purely speculation.